Right. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for our first CISMA webinar of the 2026 year. Just some quick housekeeping. I'm going to ask that everybody keep themselves muted for the time being. Feel free to drop questions, comments in the chat, and we can get to those as we go on. Um, I guess I'll kick off since it's the first session of the year. I'll kick off kind of the intention of these webinars. So the FISC or FISC's Partnership Assistance and Communications Committee organizes these calls every month to facilitate the partnership that we all kind of get together and work together to prevent and control the emergence of invasive species, the threat of invasive species, and to share information, kind of updates, um, topics of interest across all of the different CISMA areas in the state. Um, so uh, I'll talk a little bit more about this, the rest of the schedule that we have lined up at the end of this call, because we do have a slate of speakers that's finalized. But this first one is actually going to be me. So you get a double feature of Christian today. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Christian Wanamaker. I work for University of Florida. I'm here on behalf of the Invasive Species Council, and I'm kind of leading off these CISMA calls. Um, oh, this is backwards. Sorry about that. We're going to kick off with the Bothriochloa species listing updates. So these are invasive beard grasses that we're encountering across the state of Florida. And then after that, I'll give some general updates, some announcements, and go over, like I said, the schedule that we have for the next year. So let me switch over to presentations, slideshow. Cool. All right. So hello again. My name is Christian. Um, we have some. I wanted to take some time to talk about. If you know me, this is one of my nemesis species that's kind of arising in Florida. These are Bothriochloa species, so it's a number of species that belong to the same genus. We loosely refer to them as Old World blue stems, which can be kind of misleading. Um, a lot of these are very widely distributed in the Eastern Hemisphere, and a lot of them are becoming problematic in the U.S., especially in Florida lately. So I want to take some time to talk about what are we dealing with? Why are we concerned about it? What species are we looking at? I think there's been a lot of confusion about what species we're seeing in Florida. Um, and then also just give some updates about the efforts that we're putting together to kind of address this challenge. So if you've driven around Alachua County in the past probably 5 or so years, a little longer maybe, especially around October, November, you might be greeted with along the swales and roadsides an image that looks very much like this background image, this sort of maroon color. Um, oh no! Thank you all for catching this. Why can you not see my PowerPoint? Let me stop sharing and try again and see if that goes better. So do this. Can everyone see this better now? Y'all can unmute yourselves.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So as I was saying, if you've been driving around Alachua County, especially in the fall season, there's a very good chance that you've seen an image like this. This kind of maroon topped grass that's growing in swales in a rights of way in these pretty dense patches. And this is a relatively new feature. So this is one of the beard grasses that we're going to talk about today. Uh, so one of the things that kind of cued us into this being an issue, you can see I just pulled a couple of screen caps off of Facebook. A lot of different individuals noticing. this grass popping up in unusual areas, and some folks even going ahead and giving them these identifications. Um, Definitely some concern as these are out of place. Again, a lot of these folks are local botanists or amateurs who are aware of our local flora. And this kind of coincided also with a number of these voucher specimens being sent in to the UF Herbarium from different counties, and it was just kind of a random uptick that we began to notice. Um, so, kind of the way that I approach this is, we have a new grass. We were able to figure out that this belongs to Bothriochloa. I worked with Mark Frank in the UF Herbarium, and we kind of identified that much. Um, We landed on the species in Alachua County likely being Bothriochloa bladii, this Australian beard grass. But I wanted to address kind of more broadly the Bothriochloa species that we have in Florida because, well, I'll talk about it later. Um, but we only have five species that the Florida Plant Atlas shows as being present in the state of Florida. You'll notice that out of these five, if we look at the right-hand side of the column here, only this Bothriochloa lageroides is noted to have been native to Florida, um, which I'm actually going to dispute that just a little bit. But let's look at these one by one. And we'll start with that lageroides. So this is what that Bothriochloa looks like. You can see it almost looks almost like a schizocarium to me, just from a distance. Um, but then you can see that it's only been vouchered in three different counties in the state of Florida, up in the Panhandle. And when I was looking into this species, it turns out that it's sold as an ornamental, uh, and that it's really only found natively west of the Mississippi. So I think this is, I pulled up the occurrences in GBIF. You can see that really this is a species that is native to sort of the central U.S. down into Mexico. So I think that the occurrences here are probably not necessarily indicative of a native species. These observations in the plant atlas are relatively recent. They're not from the 1800s and beyond, which is what we would kind of expect from a native species in the area. So I don't even know that we should really consider this species to be native to Florida, but it is present and it is native to North America. We'll give it that much. Another species we have, this is a non-native species, Bothriochloa barbanotus. Again, this has been restricted to just a couple of observations, again in the Panhandle. Not particularly concerned about this species at all. Um, it also looks pretty distinct from what we were seeing in Alachua County, and that's the same thing with Lageroides. It looks pretty different. These silvery inflorescences that are very obviously they're white. They look almost like Q-tips. So definitely not what we were seeing in Alachua. Then we have this suite of three other species, which were a little bit better candidate species. The first of which was Bothriochloa scaemum here. So this is KR bluestem as a common name. This looks a whole lot closer to what we were seeing in not just in Alachua County, but around the state of Florida. Um, this is also, I think, when I came into this role, what a lot of folks were calling the species that we were seeing pop up increasingly in Florida, especially by that common name of KR bluestem. I'll talk a little bit about the invasion history later on and where else this is a problem. This is a weed not just in Florida. Um, but you can see that it's pretty randomly distributed throughout Florida. There's a good chance that it's more widely distributed here than we currently have records for. Grasses tend to be undersampled, and even when they are sampled, they tend to be difficult to ID confidently. Um, so I'm pretty sure if we really put together a concerted effort, we could get we could fill in some of the blanks in the plant atlas map here and voucher some more of this. I'll talk a little bit more about specific IDs. I'm going to run through the rest of these species first. So sort of the fourth one we have here is Bothriochloa pertusa. Pertusa noted, it means pitted, and you can look at this middle photograph here, and you can see that little circle. I think I have it. Yes, that little circle there. That's what pertusa is referring to. Um, And so this is a pretty distinct characteristic for this species, um, that existence of a pit on the gloom, the lower gloom there. And you can see that this is also pretty widely distributed across Florida. Again, if we really put together concerted effort, we'd probably be able to fill in some of those blanks. And then we have Bothriochloa bladii. This is the fifth species that was in the Plant Atlas within this genus. You can see that it has a little bit more of a panicle instead of a raceme, kind of multiple racemes from one point. We'll talk about the identification again in a second. Um, and you can see that from where we vouchered it, it is mostly found around Alachua County. And there was also a couple records in Broward. Um, Again, I think that if we really put together concerted effort, we would be able to find that this is much more widespread. And definitely that in a lot of cases, things that are being reported as a scammum or pertusa may be bladii or vice versa. Because honestly, the differences are not very easy to detect. So I don't want to bore everybody terribly, but I am going to address some botanical keys here. So this is from the Flora of the Southeastern United States key. This is for the whole genus of Bothriochloa. Um, you'll see here that outlined in red, we have two different points where we can pull off and get to a conclusion of Bothriochloa bladii. Um, so if anybody hasn't used a botanical key, I guess I'll very quickly address. You can see the numbers, the heading numbers one. You have these paired single digits, so you have one and one. So you'll make it as you look at step one, sessile spikelets, 4.5 to 8.5 millimeters long, or sessile spikelets, 3 to 4.5 millimeters long. So you look at the ones, and then you work your way down. Um, so there are multiple points here in the key where we can pull off and get to an answer of Bothriochloa bladii. That first break off is they address the panicles, which are red. And then they address some hairs that are actually present on the spikelet. I don't want to go into spikelet details right now. I've looked at spikelet pictures. I don't think that they're very compelling. Um, so we'll skip this one for the time being, because also you'll notice that we haven't encountered pertusa or scammum just yet until we go to the second option for Bothriochloa bladii at step 6 in the key. It's here where we talk about primary rachises of the inflorescence being longer than the lateral inflorescence branches. I'll show you pictures to kind of illuminate this, but I want to point out that they're looking at the length of elements of the flower. Okay, so once you look at the lengths of parts of the flower, that's where they filter bladii away from pertusa or scammum. And then when you look at pertusa and a scammum at step 7, you have the presence of pits or no pits on the flowers. So let's look at some pictures and kind of illuminate some of this. So these are some grass flowers. There are two different kinds of structures for grass flowers. On the left-hand side, what we have is what's called a digitate inflorescence. Digitate just means fingers-like. And you can see that all of these racemes or these spikes that have all these little individual flowers and seeds along it, they all arise from one central point. So it's kind of like a hand, where all the fingers kind of arise from a central sort of palm. Okay. Versus on the right hand side, what we have is a panicle. Um, and so in a panicle, you can see it's a much more open structure, and there's this central structure. Instead of everything coming from one point, you have this rachis, which is labeled here, off of which you have in Bothriochloa, you have these raceme structures. Okay, so this is a much more. Well, we'll see. So looking at the three species where that can be pretty easily confused, I put together a chart here for kind of what I'm looking for to distinguish these species. And this comes from multiple keys, not just one, and also a little bit of anecdotal evidence too. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we have the three species that are pretty difficult to distinguish. On the top axis, we have the different characters that I'm looking for. So when we look for the pitted gloom, we know that Bothriochloa pertusa has it. Escaemum does not. Frustratingly, in multiple keys, Bothriochloa bladii either can or cannot have gloom, the pitted gloom. So it's not necessarily a great way to distinguish between these species. You also have coloration of the inflorescence. So Bothriochloa escaemum, the whole flower can look this sort of reddish maroon color at maturity. Uh, Pertusa does not have that. It typically stays a greenish color. And bladii also pretty distinctly at maturity can have this purplish red color to the flower. So again, we're seeing that you can't just look at one color here to distinguish. Scent is an interesting element to look for. I always encourage folks when they're learning ID to use all of your senses to try to identify things and also to look for multiple lines of evidence. Um, and so I haven't noticed or I haven't read any kind of scent associated with Bothriochloa scammum. I would be excited to hear if anybody else has encountered that. Um, Bothriochloa pertusa, again, no scent that's ever been documented. I haven't noticed it either. Bothriochloa bladii, on the other hand, usually has a scent associated to it, especially when it's flowering. Less so if you try to crush leaves or stems, but typically when it's flowering, there is some kind of scent. It can be strong, it can be kind of mild, but it is distinct. And then we have the last two elements that I like to look at is the presence of that central rachis, that central element of the panicle. So in Bothriochloa scammum, we really don't see that. It doesn't really have the central structure. Instead, it's much more digitate. Remember, it's much more like a hand. Um, Bothriochloa pertusa is considered digitate to subdigitate. So what that means is it's almost like my hand, where you have from one point you have multiple racemes that come off, but sometimes you have a little bit of a distance between another raceme, but not a very central line. Rather, it's a little bit more similar to digitate. Um, but Bothriochloa bladii, we kind of distinctly get terminology in the keys that references it being elongated. So this idea that we have this very distinct central rachis or central axis to the flower, which can be 4 to 20 centimeters long. So there's a huge degree of variability still in how long that central rachis is, but there generally is one.
Mm.
Another thing that we look at is the number of racemes, the number of those spikes that have all the flowers running along it. So you'll see there's a huge amount of variability between these three different species, but there's a lot of overlap as well. So Escammum, 5 to 15 racemes, which can be 4 to 6 centimeters long. In Pertusa, 3 to 8, usually up to 13 racemes, but they tend to be a little bit smaller. And then bladii, you just get numerous. Typically, I kind of interpret that as being larger than any of the other options that you can see here. And they can be kind of in the middle here between 2 to 5 centimeters long. So again, a huge amount of overlap between these three different species. Interesting of note, pulled this from the flora of China, that Bothriochloa bladii is most practically treated as in a broad sense to include all of the forms that have an elongate inflorescence axis. They really point to that character being the best way to distinguish these species. Additionally, the habit is usually not stoloniferous, so that's usually not running along the soil level, producing roots. And the racemes, and this is less significant to me, are less obviously hairy than in Escammum or Pertusa. So, now that I've bored you with charts and keys, let's look at a few more pictures and try to illustrate these differences. So we have Escama on the left, Pertusa in the center, and Bladii on the right. Let's look really at this question of that central rachis. So in Escamum, you can see there's a little bit of a central rachis going on here, but then if we look at the first raceme, we can see that it's much longer than that central axis, which rules out things like bladii in my mind. Moving on to Pertusa, we can see that that central rachis, that central axis, is also relatively short, and that first raceme is pretty long relative. Okay, so far we have something that's distinguishing these species. And then when we look at bladii, boom, that central rachis is really long. You can see how many racemes there are, and those racemes are shorter than the overall length, excuse me, of the central rake is. So this seems to be a pretty good way to distinguish these species because the coloration doesn't necessarily do it. The pits can be present or absent. Um, the one thing that I want to caution you when we're looking at these characters of flower part length is that if you're looking at an immature flower or a flower which is not fully extended, then Bothriochloa bladii, for example, can look a lot like that picture of a scammon, where all those racemes are kind of bunched up and it doesn't seem to have much of a central axis if the flower hasn't fully extended. So that's something to be aware of as well. Another really frustrating thing in this group, which likely makes up a huge chunk of why we're having a hard time getting to confident identifications, is their hybrid potential. So we know that Bothriochloa bladii can hybridize pretty easily and frequently within other species of Bothriochloa, and also with a couple of species in different genera even. Um, so this points to obviously we're probably going to have changes in taxonomy if someone actually sits down and looks at these species with the lens of a taxonomist, um, especially if they're able to do some genetic work to kind of parse apart what these entities are. Um, we also know that a lot of these species typically are self-compatible or even apomictic, so they're able to, without fertilization, produce seed. So the whole picture here just points to the potential for hybridization, especially where these three species are already present in the state, and that their introduced ranges are overlapping. So the joys of taxonomy and grass ID kind of meet here in a fun way. I do also, again, want to encourage you to use your nose when you're trying to identify things. Again, Bothriochloa bladii, in my mind, almost always has a scent to it. Some folks like it, some folks do not. I tend to find that it has these notes, if I were to call it a fragrance. It has this sort of really musky scent that can be kind of pine solly and citrusy, but at the same time has this like sulfurous apricot-y smell, and it's also very chemically. I don't know. This is especially noticeable in my mind in the summer. It's something about this. I assume it's just a volatile compound that you can smell on hot days, but also after it's been mown. If I step out of my office and there's Bothriochloa nearby and it has been mown recently, I can smell it in the air almost immediately before I can see it. So, just another thing. I'd be curious to know if if folks have different descriptors for what the scent of this plant is. Let me know. So, a little bit about the invasion history. So, these species, as I mentioned, some of them have a history of invasion outside of Florida. So, KR bluestem or Bothriochloa scammum, you can see on the right, is pretty widely distributed. It's not just present in Florida. It's actually a state-listed noxious weed in Arizona and New Mexico. It's also listed kind of at the same level as Fisk would be listing things in Missouri, non-regulatory list that is, which is a species of concern. Despite not being listed in Texas, there is a lot of research that comes out of Texas about the impacts and management of Bothriochloa scammum, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. So we know that it's causing problems in Texas as well. So this is a pretty widespread weed, which is interesting because as we'll see in a second, when it comes to Florida, it typically has not demonstrated huge amounts of impacts in Florida. Um, Bothriochloa pertusa, or pitted beard grass, is really not documented very widely outside of Florida. Um, it's certainly not listed as a noxious weed or as a like a species of concern outside of Florida. Bothriochloa bladii is not a noxious weed, but it is listed in Missouri, which is interesting because you can see on the bottom right there, Bothriochloa bladii is It's got a wider distribution than Pertusa does in the US, but it's also not very widely distributed, right? It seems to pop up in a few different counties, but mostly, if you had to kind of pick out a hub, it looks like it might be Florida. So again, I'm not going to read all of this, don't worry. But the idea just being that Bothriochloa scammum or KR bluestem is a pretty undesirable species. This is from the first part is from the Native Plant Society of Texas here. Um, it destroys habitat, it crowds out native plants. It does things that invasive plants do. It also seems to spread horizontally, especially when it's mowed or grazed. So you're seeing a lot of tolerance to that kind of mechanical control effort. Um, it also dominates native grassland species and reducing species richness, right? That's coming from Texas invasives. As I mentioned, there's a lot of research that comes out of Texas on ischemum impacts. And then for bladii, from this actually comes from Nebraska. They refer to Bothriochloa bladii as an aggressive bunch grass that can dominate pastures and rangelands, that also outcompetes native grasses and reduces biodiversity. And they note that it's not palatable or nutritious, so it's not likely to be grazed upon. They also point out some possible allelopathy. So the release of chemicals into the soil that can inhibit the growth or reproduction of neighboring plants. I haven't seen any direct evidence of that outside of this mention, so that's an interesting thing to be aware of, and perhaps a future research avenue. In Florida, we know that Bothriochloa was introduced deliberately in the early 20th century. We were curious to know if this was a good forage species, which is one of its listed uses in the Eastern Hemisphere. It's noted as in some cases, a favorable forage. In fact, Australian bluestem is called that not because it is native to Australia, but because it's a preferred grass there. It's actually one of the preferred forage species in Australia. Um, so just a point of interest. So we introduced it for forage evaluation. We also know that there were multiple genetic lineages that were introduced for each of these species when they were being evaluated. Records are really hard to find as far as where this project went. Presumably, it didn't go very far because it's not a species that is used in Florida pasture or sold in Florida pasture, but you can find it commercially for sale by some big seed producers outside of Florida, I should note. We do have earlier herbarium specimens from Alachua County and Miami-Dade County dating back to the 1940s. I think that's where the earliest vouchered specimens come from in the state of Florida. So again, we have this sort of picture coming together where we introduce these species roughly in between the 20s to the 40s, and every once in a while, when we look at what's been vouchered, you would see a Bothriochloa pop up in Florida, but they seem to persist on sites pretty locally, staying in areas that are considered, roadways, rights of way, disturbance areas, and never really behaving in ways that caused a whole lot of alarm until recently, it seems. So I have a couple of different sites where we're noticing Bothriochloa become pretty problematic. This is a pretty recent example from Austin Cary Forest here in Alachua County. Gage LaPierre, a coworker of mine, actually, back in 2021, had posted this Facebook post asking about the status of this plant. And again, look, he's identified this as Bothriochloa pertusa. Thinking back to what we looked at in the keys and that bottom left picture, I'm thinking that's probably bladii, considering how long that central axis is, right? Um, so Also of note here, this is moving from a roadside. It's pretty abundant in the roadside, but it's moving into this intact sandhill, um, or sorry, flatwood rather, which had been burned earlier in the year. So that's always something of alarm to see species move from these sort of more disturbed areas post-disturbance, like a fire, even a prescribed fire, further into more intact habitat. And that's sort of a theme that we're noticing with these Bothriochloa species. This is from Bell Ridge, WMA in Gilchrist County. These are EDMAPS points that I had collected. On the left-hand side, it's just an overlook of where we kind of broadly found Bothriochloa distributed throughout the WMA. For the most part, it's in a parking lot. It's on fire breaks. But I want to draw your attention to that little cluster of 3 points on the western boundary of the park there. If you look at the top right, I've zoomed in on those 3 different points, and what I found is, well, I have it annotated. This is an access road, or it's also a fire break in within the WMA, where you have this Bothriochloa species in huge abundances running along this fire break. Um, but then about 60 feet in, you have a couple of isolated plants, and then about 120 feet away from that small patch, you have, as shown in the bottom right picture, almost this 15, 20-foot square population of flowering Bothriochloa. So in this case, it's not even a contiguous population. It seems to be this scattered um, patches, if you will, of plants that are moving into. If you've ever been to Bell Ridge, you know it's beautiful sandhill habitat. So it's always concerning to see these patches pop up within sandhill. Um, Also of note, this was burned the year previous. So again, we're seeing this sort of invasion post prescribed fire, probably moving in from the fire breaks where the abundance is really quite high. And in this case, moving in, what is it, 180 feet into the unit. And then again, in Fort White WMA, these are more points that I had collected in EdMaps. In this case, I actually was able to walk an area. I was so surprised by how dense this infestation was. You can see it's about a third of an acre. So I was able to walk the polygon, which I think gives a really great illustration of how deep this goes. I don't think I measured this one. It goes about 200 feet into the unit again. Um, and same kind of site history, had been burned the previous year. There is Bothriochloa all over the fire breaks and in the rights of way, and it is now moving post-fire into those units. And you can see it's forming pretty dense monoculture in that right-hand picture. Almost all of the grass that you're seeing there uh, is Bothriochloa. I had identified it as Bothriochloa blattii. Again, we could talk about that and look at some pictures to see if we can nail down the exact identity. But definitely something of concern if this species is able to tolerate fire and move into these units with fire. Uh, and I say that it's moving with fire, and mostly because we don't seem most of the secondary dispersal seems like it moves according to a couple different ways. The first of which is moving locally with contaminated equipment. This is why all the rights of way and swales in Gainesville and increasingly residential yards are dealing with Bothriochloa infestations, and that's because they get on mower decks, and these seeds are carried on these mower decks. Or when we were when we were in Fort White, seeing seed heads get lodged in the trim of a truck, and being like, "That's a dispersal pathway, right?" You need to be careful and make sure that you're doing decontamination protocols on any of the heavy machinery that you're using to mow or manage areas where there could be Bothriochloa. They do have the seeds have these awns, these relatively long and somewhat rigid hairs. They're not terribly pointy, but they can get kinks in them and can spiral. And there's always a possibility that some of these disjunct populations are occurring because of the seeds are hitchhiking onto either animals via their fur or onto hikers' clothing or just people's clothing. Despite being some of these seed heads looking pretty furry, there's no evidence to suggest wind dispersal, so that's a relatively positive thing in my mind that most of the secondary dispersal seems to be pretty slow and pretty localized. Talking about the fire adaptation, so as a USDA manual on the control of old blue stems, that's what OWB stands for here. They note that both of these species are quickly established, and they're talking about Bothriochloa blattii and Iscamus, the two like more well-known weedy species. They're both quickly established. They produce huge numbers of seed, and they can tolerate severe drought, heavy grazing, fire, and concerningly, some amount of winter freezing, which is why a lot of these species are found further north than Florida. We also have, again, multiple accounts of anecdotal evidence of the fire tolerance and the ability of these species to colonize post-fire. As I mentioned at Fort White, Bell Ridge, and in Austin Carey, they all had plots that were invaded, or I should say areas, not plots, that were invaded within a year after prescribed burn. And then we also have some experimental data that hasn't been published that shows that post-fire Bothriochloa percent cover and plots that otherwise just has native ground cover, it tends to expand much more quickly than that native ground cover does. So hopefully that stuff will be published soon, and we can actually have some figures and some actual detail to show for that. There are some treatment suggestions for these Bothriochloa species. Obviously, if you catch them soon and early, especially before they flower, manual removal of small populations is pretty effective. When it comes to chemical control, glyphosate and imazapyr have both been suggested. Of course, with both of those herbicides, you need to be careful. They're non-selective. You're very likely to hurt other ground cover species that are in the area. So that's something to be aware of. Burning used alone is not recommended, right? What we're seeing is that it not only does Old World bluestem species tolerate fire, it also seems to bounce back more quickly than native ground cover. So almost in this Kogan grass kind of way, where prescribed fire, if not done carefully with other management techniques, probably just seems to open an opportunity for these species to spread and to colonize new areas rather than actually controlling it. Mowing is not terribly effective. We see that there is a lot of these species have the ability to start growing more prostrate. They lay against the ground and almost become stoloniferous. I have seen Bothriochloa bladii produce flower and seed in heavily mown medians, and you can't even identify the grass except that there is a seed stalk that has, or a flower stalk that has popped up. And it can be 4 to 6 inches tall, and it still is producing seed. They really don't care about getting mown. And my concern there is that in that situation, you're likely going to be spreading the seed if you're mowing those areas. I also worked with this. I worked with Bothriochloa bladii a little bit in my thesis research, and this is unpublished data, but it seems like there is an after ripening period on the seed. It takes about 6 months from the seed being shed before that seed will germinate. So if you're thinking about management of this species, you really need to think about revisiting areas, even if you hit it with herbicide, even if you've mown it, even if you've burned it. You need to be going out and revisiting because there's a good chance that after 6 months, you'll have new seedlings because it seems to be able to seed bank a little bit because of that after ripening requirement. So on to listing and updates part of this. This is pretty short. Bothriochloa bladii was assessed in 2023 as a high invasion risk. As I mentioned, that was kind of a result of Mark Frank addressing this species and asking for it to be assessed when we were getting new reports of it and new voucher specimens coming in, and also those Facebook posts and similar kind of, hey, what's this notifications. We're waiting on assessments of pertusa and escammum. I would be shocked if they come out any kind of different, to be honest. These assessments can be kind of challenging to complete when you have taxonomic uncertainty, like I just mentioned. We are dealing with this species or with this species complex. But it seems quite likely these are all going to be ranked as high-risk species. Also, the list of counties where it has been found is just expanding. So, and then the last thing that I wanted to touch on really is that we were able to get this listed with FISC. So these species, I added Pertusa onto here because we have met since this published list came out and added Pertusa onto here. A lot of the reason why it didn't go on as a category 1 or category 2 is we still are looking for more evidence that this species is moving into intact habitat and outside of roadways or areas of disturbance. We're starting to see that happen, but we really would like to have a better picture of how this species is behaving, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to put together this presentation and kind of raise awareness. You'll notice also and taxonomic uncertainties reflected here in the way that these species have been listed. They've been listed all together, and with that language of any of these 3 species and the putative progeny thereof. So any of the potential hybrids of these 3 species that we are noticing, they are all currently on the FISC watch list. So With that, I'm gonna go ahead and end this presentation kind of with a rallying call. Hopefully, you all have learned how to identify this, and I'm really hoping that we can get more eyes out in the field and more reports of this, so that if this does become a major issue, we can kind of get ahead of it, become before it becomes, Kogan grass all over again. So, with that, I will stop talking. I'll look in the comments here and see if there are any questions, but also feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any questions you might have. Chat. Oh, Grace, does it smell similar to Heteropogon? That's interesting. I don't think I've noticed that. Oh, and Anne, and a volunteer had an asthma attack. Oof.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. The smell is similar to Hydroquinone to me. Um, it's just really noxious.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a potent scent. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. All right. If there are no other questions, I'm gonna move on over. I have a couple of quick updates that we can give. Some Fisk pack announcements. I need to share my screen again. Am I not seeing the option? Come here. Hmm, there we go. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay. So we wanted to let you all know that there is a free invasive plant training that is available. This is the trainee tier for the tiered training, which many of you might have heard about. The Invasive Species Council and especially Deb Tharp have really put a ton of time into these training materials. This is an online course that is free for anybody who's interested in taking it, that addresses plant identification, treatment approaches, field safety. And again, this is really targeting volunteers and new crew members who are working with invasive plant management. It's supposed to take about 2 hours to complete. You can find the enroll link here. Also, there was an email that Deb sent out earlier through the listserv that had the information about this training, so you can find another link there. Also want to point out for our lane managers, there are additional tiers. This is the first tier out of three. So there are higher level courses that will be coming out. So these are, or sorry, there are three others for crew leaders, crew members, and then also at the highest level there, invasive managers. So these are training courses that are really supposed to sort of emulating the way that we teach prescribed fire and burn management. But except we are now focusing on invasive species. So the kind of what do you need to know at all these different levels for invasive species management. Those other courses are under development. Those courses will not be free. That is that's one of the challenges with, or I guess opportunities for extension programming is with additional training, you might have to pay for some of it. But these would be really great courses to kind of standardize the information that we're all working with and to share again that information around invasive species management. That'll be great for promotions and upcoming professionals and anybody who's thinking about a career shift, maybe. The UF IFAS assessment is also putting out a call. They have recently received a request to assess Camelina diffusa, um, one of the day flowers. If you are aware of this plant, if you've dealt with it, they are asking for folks to fill out their questionnaire. If you have questions, you can reach out also to Dr. Suckman Kim about this, and hopefully we'll get a good bit of data so they can complete this assessment. We also have a be on the lookout advisory. Giant Salvinia was recently located in Leon County, in a lake in Leon County. So FWC has put together this advisory and an ID guide for Giant Salvinia. Uh, to my knowledge, it has not been located anywhere else since. But of course, if you find it at one spot, it's unfortunately likely somewhere else. So this is one of those plants that we are ahead of on the invasion curve. So if you see this, if you think you see this, make sure that you report it, and we can get some eyes on it and make sure that it can be dealt with before it becomes super problematic. The last thing I want to touch on quickly is just the rest of the year's call schedule. So we have, like I said, a slate of wonderful speakers lined up throughout the rest of the year, and I hope that you will join us for many of these talks. We put together this schedule and the slate of speakers sort of in the mindset that Fisk is now an all taxo organization, so we are increasingly trying to get those folks who work with invasive wildlife to come and share the work that they're doing and give us updates so that we can all work as a slightly more fine-tuned organization with invasive species across Florida, regardless of their taxonomy. So a lot of cool talks coming up. I hope that we'll see you there. This also has been sent out in the most recent invitation for our monthly CISMA calls with the invitation. And with that, I am all done. Thank you so much for joining us. This call has been recorded, so we'll put it up on our YouTube channel. And I hope that I'll see you all next month. Have a great week.